Thank you for coming out to Science Study Break this evening on earthquakes. The legalese is right here. You'll notice that there is a man taking still photos and there is someone recording video, so there's a possibility that you could show up in one or the other of those places. If that's a problem, if you're hiding from the law or something, then you need to put on your disguise now. This program will use scenes from This Is the End, The Impossible, Knocked Up, San Andreas, Tremors, so nothing naughty to worry about here totally with a movie lineup like that, but there's some language, and of course with scenes of earthquakes and what have you, there will be humans in distress, so be aware of that. So this is a program that is brought to you by the UT Libraries. Specifically, people who work very hard to make this happen are the good folks at the Life Science Library, but a whole bunch of other people throughout the libraries, including the folks listed here. And of course, tonight's presenters, who I'll get around to in a couple of minutes, Dr. Patricia Clayton and Dr. Clifford Froelich. And in order for us to be in this lovely room where it's so easy to film and where we have this fabulous AV setup and to have dinner, delicious dinner that y'all are all noshing on right now, we want to thank our generous supporter, University Federal Credit Union, who has been backing Science Study Break for many years now, and we're very grateful to them. Science Study Break has actually been going on for 10 years at this point, 10 years old. And if you want to see some of our past programs, you can visit the Life Science Library webpage to view our archive. We weren't always filming, and then back in the day when we first started filming, we had RTF students who wanted to practice filming. So we have some shows where there's no film, some shows where there's a little bit of film, and then when we moved to this room, it all just became fabulous. So you can look at some of our past programs there. You can also find the videos of our past programs in Texas ScholarWorks, which is the UT Library's repository. Since we will be looking at things this evening that have to do with earthquakes and seismology, but also with structures and stresses, you may want, of course, and since this is sponsored by the UT Libraries and you're at the UT Libraries program, you of course will have a burning information need for more resources about earthquakes and about structures and stresses after this. So I want to point out that we have several library subject specialists that you can consult. And here they are: Dennis Trombatore at the Geology Library, Lorraine Dallas, who is one of the engineering librarians, and Robin Rosenberg, also engineering librarian. So their contact information can be found by going to guides.lib.utexas.edu and looking through those different subject pages. You'll find the library liaisons for those different subjects. Okay. And now I want to talk a little bit about our presenters. First, Dr. Patricia Clayton. She's an assistant professor in the Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering Department. She earned a BS in Civil Engineering from North Carolina State and an MS in Civil Engineering from the University of Washington. Dr. Clayton received her PhD in Civil Engineering, also from the University of Washington, and her technical interests revolve around innovative self-centering steel plate shear wall lateral force resisting systems. That could make quite an acronym, couldn't it?
Great.
For enhancing seismic performance of buildings. Next, we have Dr. Clifford Froelich, who is an associate director and senior research scientist at the Institute for Geophysics. He earned a BS from Grinnell College and MS and a PhD from Cornell University. He is a seismologist with an enduring interest in deep earthquakes, Texas earthquakes, moonquakes, and the statistical analysis of earthquake catalogs. And also, in late 2002, he was on board an Antarctic research support vessel, and he's written several letters that are up on his webpage, and you should totally go and look at them, and there's pictures, and it's really fascinating stuff. And so with that, with no further ado, let's get to the science and the study and the break. Doctors Clayton and Froelich, let's get going. So here's our first topic. Yay! So here's our first topic. I'm gonna
you sure you can do it? I can grab you. I'm free. 1, 2, 3. Where are you? I'm gonna swing across. I got you, buddy. You're gonna hold my weight, all of it. Okay, come on. You can hold on to my full weight. I can do it. I don't want to stop. Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, now the first topic then is cracks opening and swallowing people and cars and so on. And that happened in a couple of these movies. The second one was San Andreas. Next.
There we go.
Well, it turns out that in real earthquakes, most cracks are only a few feet deep. I mean, basically, they're just surface features. And I've been studying earthquakes for 40 years, and I can find no documented case of people ever being swallowed up by an opening crack during an earthquake. On the other hand, this happens in most earthquake movies. Now, it does turn out that after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, there was a news story about a cow getting swallowed up by a crack. And many years after the 1906 quake, a son of the man that owned the cow was interviewed again. And upon the second interview, what he said was, hey, look, the cow had died and we had to bury her. That night, along came the earthquake, which opened up a big crack, and we tipped it in with the feet sticking out. Then along came those newspaper reporters, and we weren't about to spoil a good story. So again, and it turns out most people are really sort of too nimble and too alert to fall into a crack. Now, that was before cell phones. So it could be in the future that people will fall into cracks during earthquakes, but I rate the idea of cracks opening and swallowing people, cars, and so forth. My science verdict is implausible.
But maybe not in the U.S., but elsewhere, they actually have divergent faults where plates are moving apart from one another. Here's a picture in Iceland, but you don't see the hot lava of the earth boiling beneath, and there's no people falling into these. I think there's a few others in the world, right?
There are a few others, but again, they're open. Like this thing probably opens at 2 inches a year, and so if you are swallowed up by that, that's some cell phone.
There's enough time for the grass to grow in the cracks.
Enough time for the grass to grow, and we'll get more on grass later.
Yes. Ooh, that was a good foreshadowing.
Okay, the last two clips we saw were from the movie San Andreas. And although the clips didn't mention it, this was a magnitude 9.6 earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. And if you look around, there's actually other movies where in California we had a 10.5 magnitude earthquake. And there was one I found a reference to with 11.5 magnitude earthquake in California, although I wasn't able to actually get the clip. I couldn't tell whether it was a future clip or what. But is it plausible that we would have a 9.6 or 11.5 in California? Next. Well, I'm a science geek, and so sometimes we use stuff called equations. But don't worry, basically, if you were in high school, you had a hand calculator, and the equation is there's something that relates the magnitude to the fault area and the fault slip. And when you're in high school, you had to find the logarithm function. But If you can use your high school calculator, it turns out that if the fault area is 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, in other words, like a crack in your windshield, the equation says this is like a magnitude -6. Okay, now if there's a fault about the size of a classroom, 7 by 7 meters or 20 by 20 feet, this is a magnitude 0. Something about the size of the football stadium, 100 meters by 100 meters, is about a magnitude 2.2. And you go on in the equation, and something changes. By the time you get up to magnitude 8, you notice before 8, the faults are about as wide as they are tall. But when you get up to the point where the crust properties change, it's the thickness of the crust times a long piece, so it's 40 by 120 kilometers. This is about like the 1906 California earthquake. And the biggest earthquakes of the California type, where you're getting these plates moving horizontally, are about magnitude 8.2. Next slide. So in California, again, we have what's called a strike-slip fault. That is, the plates are moving horizontally. Elsewhere on the Earth, like in Alaska or Japan, we have plates that are colliding, and those are called thrust faults. And it turns out you can get bigger earthquakes on the kinds where the plates are colliding. For example, the biggest earthquakes have magnitude of about 9.5, and in those, you're rupturing the entire thickness of the plate, 100 kilometers or about 60 miles, and you're rupturing along the surface like 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles. So if you take this equation and say, well, I want a bigger quake, if you had a fault that ruptured around the entire equator of the Earth, 40,000 kilometers, you'd get something like a magnitude 11.1. So next slide. If we're trying to get big quakes, like I say, the biggest quakes known, here's Chile, where we have the area that went up and down, which was actually about 1,100 kilometers long along the coast of Chile, magnitude 9.5. 11.1, you're rupturing around the entire equator, and again, there are no faults that I know of like that. And in order to get up to something like 11.5, maybe you circle the Earth twice as it ruptures. So anyway, the verdict for a California earthquake with a magnitude of 9.6 or bigger is implausible.
If you have any questions for our presenters, please raise your hand. We will have someone bring you the microphone. You don't have to say who you are. You can remain anonymous. But we do want to capture your questions since we are recording this, so we do need to bring you the microphone. So questions, comments?
But first of all, while we're naming names, you mentioned Dennis Trombatore, the geology librarian, and you said you could find him online or something like that. Don't do that. He's right there in the audience. And so the only exits are back there, and so if you want to see him, don't let him get away. He's a wonderful geology librarian, so please don't let him get away.
Does anyone have any questions for our presenters? Raise your hand. Okay.
Hello. Okay. You mentioned fault slip. I'm a civil engineering major, so I don't exactly know what that means. So if you could explain that just a little bit more.
It's not complicated in general. If you have a fault that ruptures, there's a part of it that doesn't stay intact during the earthquake, and so if it slips a certain amount. And of course, at the edges, it doesn't slip at all. In the center, it slips a lot more. So when we say something slips 10 meters, we mean an average over the part that didn't stay intact during the earthquake.
Okay. How do you measure that?
Oh, okay, that's a can of worms. You'd have to talk to a scientist about that.
Oh, okay. I'll go find one.
But you can actually see photos in California where there's faults where the slip is right underneath a fence or some other line of trees or a row of crops or something. You can see how much it displaces.
Yeah,
so that's my layman's attempt at measuring it.
It's great.
The fence moved.
There are great places like in California where you have fence lines and after the quake they're offset. Most faults, or a lot of faults, don't come to the surface, so it's not so simple. But yeah, what she said.
Yeah, I'm a civil engineer too, so I put it down to the simplest terms. I don't do the science.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? Whoops. Okay.
This seems kind of like a little bit of a stupid question, but I'd imagine like with each slip fault thing that there's always like a lot of friction involved.
Sorry.
So
sorry.
why don't we get things like fires or some other like heat emitting thing from?
You mean heat from the friction?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, of course, rock is a horrible conductor, and so you can make the rock hot enough to melt the rock, and 2 meters away, it's going to be a while before it gets there. So, basically, because rock is not a good conductor.
But we will see fires in a sec for a different reason, though.
Yeah.
Okay, then we can move on to topic number 2, which is structural failures.
The magnetic pulse rate is increased before each one of them.
I got a pattern, my friend. That was a 2.2. Our model's predictive.
We got it right, man. Finally.
Yeah, we sure did.
Shit.
What's wrong?
The pulse rates are spiking again. They're huge.
Serious? Yeah.
We're about to have a major quake.
It jumped to a 7.1. Jesus, can't get the hell out of there. Everybody get off the dam. Everybody off. Hurry up. Stand behind the barriers. Stay behind the barriers.
I got you.
Please. Oh my God.
Close your eyes.
Yeah, okay. So that was some pretty dramatic imagery, right? All the buildings crumbling down, the dams exploding. So before we start talking about the structure, we'll look at the next slide. I wanted to mention, first of all, come on, this guy. Round of applause for the heroic guy who just saved that child. Yeah.
Those were seismologists that were heroic.
Yeah, they were. So this guy running full speed, carrying a child while the ground is shaking and the dam is crumbling around him. So I've only actually been in one earthquake. I was in Japan for the 9.0 Tohoku earthquake in 2011. I know. It was the only one I've ever been in, and I was there for the big one. But I was like 200 miles away, very far away. And I could barely walk in a straight line while the earthquake was going on. This dude is running full sprint with a child. Wow, the ground is shaking. Amazing. So, first of all, implausible. There we go.
But you can barely walk in a straight line after work.
I do have a hard time walking in a straight line. It's true. So what are we talking about? Dams, failure? We're going to see some cracks, maybe. This is an example in California. These cracks, time for engineers to go and inspect, repair, make sure the dam's all right again and safe again. I was looking for the most extreme example of dam failure from an earthquake. And what I found was a dam. This is in Taiwan. This is right over the fault. So we're talking about that fault that's rupturing and slipping and moving. So the permanent deformation from one end of the dam to the other was 29 feet. The fault moved. And this is the damage that you're looking at. So no explosions here. Yeah, it can't retain that much water anymore, but this is kind of a worst case scenario. So not so many explosions. As far as buildings go, so building codes, what we design buildings for is to be safe for people. So buildings are not collapsing during earthquakes. The minimum standard for the code kind of says that we want buildings to have less than a 10% probability of collapse during what we call the maximum considered earthquake. And this is an earthquake that happens on average once every 2,500 years. So the likelihood of every single building in the whole city of San Francisco just shattering to the ground, not so likely. But we go back real quick. What you might see is you will see some cracks, you will see some damage. What I might consider one of the more extreme types of failure in one of these high rises is what we call a soft story collapse, where one story might just pancake. Usually there's some sort of irregularity or something going on with that story, but it's not like the whole building from the top down just falling over. Other structures, you didn't see many of these in San Francisco, but what we call unreinforced masonry structures, so those old brick buildings. So those bricks are pretty susceptible to failure and falling and might injure people below them, but usually those are also not the high-rise buildings, so those are in more the older areas of the city. So, implausible, but very, very good CGI. Yeah. The imagery of fires. Fires everywhere. So we already had a question about fire, so we automatically think fires when we think of earthquakes. So what these are caused by usually is you might have damage to like a gas line, right? You have a gas leak, and any kind of spark, static friction can set off a fire. So if we look at the early days of earthquake engineering in the US, so back in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the vast majority of the damage from that earthquake was actually caused by fire. One of my favorite stories was one fire was started by a woman who woke up after the earthquake. It happened early in the morning. She woke up to make breakfast for her family. And the chimney had collapsed in her building. And she was just going on with her day. And started a fire. And so the firefighters came. This fire is known as the ham and eggs fire of San Francisco. As the fire's going on, the firefighters come. The water lines have been damaged, so they aren't ever able to bring water into to put out the fires. Fire starts spreading towards City Hall. Oh no, what do we do? The mayor says, okay, firefighters, tear down the buildings around City Hall so we can create like a buffer zone to break the fire so the fire can't come and get City Hall. So what do the firefighters do? Well, we got to demolish some buildings quickly. What are you going to use? Dynamite. You're going to use dynamite. And if you use it improperly, you might actually start more fires that you then can't put out. And that's exactly what happened. So tons of damage to fires. And after this, actually most of the building code changes after this earthquake had to do with improving the fire safety of buildings. It wasn't until later earthquakes in California that we started thinking, oh, we should actually make our structures a little bit safer too. And now, because we know that fires can be such an issue, most cities and insurance companies in California actually require you have home gas shut-off valves that during an earthquake will immediately shut off gas. So we're doing much better nowadays. I don't know if we're going to see as many fires as you saw in that video, but I would call it plausible. Yeah.
Well, for whatever reason, that one is not playing, which is unfortunate. But if you observe carefully, You will see that there's some scientific equipment here. So if you would care to discuss the scientific equipment.
Well, so it's a shame you couldn't see the clip because the clip is stellar. I encourage everyone to go see. What was the name of this? Is Knocked Up.
Knocked Up. Yeah.
They have an earthquake. You know what Seth Rogen's character is enjoying himself in his home. While
It's an intellectual movie.
Yeah, it's a really good one. So partly this isn't here for comedic effect, but you know what? There's actually some engineering connections here. So a bomb, any vessel of water, actually, for that matter, think of the engineering applications of it. So in structural engineering, we actually use vessels of water, put them in a building to actually dampen the shaking of the building. So as the building is trying to sway during an earthquake, that water in that vessel, whatever it may be, is sloshing in the opposite direction. So it's providing this force that's reacting against the building to try to restore it and bring it back to the center. So it's actually reducing the amount of movement in a building during an earthquake. These are like slosh tanks or liquid dampers in buildings. So there's your connection. And oddly enough, this is plausible.
What do you think the engineers were smoking when they thought of that technology?
I know. We can gain inspiration from anywhere.
If you have a question, please raise your hand and someone will bring you the microphone.
It might be slightly off this session, I guess, but not relating to Bongtel. But the loads itself, I mean, whenever we're talking wind loads, wave loads, whatever, we have a pretty decent idea about at least some sort of statistics about it. What do you do regarding to earthquakes? I mean, what's the frequency of the loading? What's the direction? That sort of stuff. Any good idea? Or do we just make, well, as qualified guesses as we can do?
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty in that. So the structural engineers, we rely on the seismologists and the geotechnical engineers, and they're looking at things like what faults are in the area, what's the maximum magnitudes those might be able to produce. You can probably do a lot better job of trying to predict the recurrence rate of some of these faults that I can. But basically, well, the information that they accumulate, and you can probably expand on this, in our building codes, we're designing for a 2% in 50-year probability of an earthquake occurring because we estimate buildings will last about 50 years. So we use all this information they get about the size of earthquakes and how often they occur, and somehow this magical probabilistic math comes into play that spits out to us what shaking level we should expect during that time period. And the geotechnical engineers can also look and say, well, this particular site that this building is going to be on, well, it's on a soft clay, so your shaking might actually amplify more than what's down at the bedrock at the geologic level that the seismologists are working on. So we all kind of work together, and they give us forces to design for, basically. So.
In terms of earthquake prediction, one of the dirty secrets of earthquake prediction is that sort of 95% of it is you look at past earthquakes and say, hey, I'll bet we'll have more like that. And of course, so in areas where there aren't earthquakes, or when you get bigger earthquakes that only happen every 1,000 years, earthquake prediction is really bad. Now, at the second level, as to what happens in an earthquake, again, probably 90% of it is engineers or my kind of seismologists putting out equipment and measuring stuff. The other 10% is physics. You know, I talked about how long a fault was, and there's, physics. Physicists know stuff, although not as much as they think they do.
They know stuff, we guess it's stuff.
Could you wait for the microphone, please? It's coming.
Oh, there it is.
There it is.
I recently read a summary of a paper describing that modern buildings that were more complex in their external form were more likely to sustain damage in an earthquake than more traditional rectilinear buildings. And I don't really understand why that is, and I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So was this by chance a paper out of China? No, because I think that I heard at Shanghai they actually made some legislation to say we're not going to allow some of these crazy irregular buildings anymore because we're concerned about the safety of them for these types of events. So that's why I wonder if it was connected.
I'm not certain. It was a summary in Science News.
Okay.
I've forgotten where the original paper was published.
Yeah, so the issue there is basically anytime you get an irregularity in a building, that can be a building that has an odd shape or a change vertically in geometry, you're basically creating a stress concentration. If you think about... What's something that breaks? Huh? Glass. Okay, yeah, glass. You could have a nick in the glass or a change in the shape of that glass shape. If you apply a load to it, try to bend it, that's where it's going to fail and break. So in most of these buildings, it's usually a change in geometry or a change in the structural system. Oh, we had braces going up the building or a column going up the building, but because an architect wanted a really fancy shape, that column's no longer there or that brace is no longer there, so there's an irregularity that causes stress concentration. That's where you're going to get the failure. Yeah.
So sort of a follow-up on that. Many cities, and including Austin and even this campus, are adding on to existing buildings, including the Jackson School building. So are those buildings built to new standards, or they just say, screw it, we'll just do it the way it was before?
Yeah, if you're going to make major renovations to buildings, you usually have to build those to the newest standard. And oftentimes there's also requirements to then upgrade whatever the building you're renovating, upgrade that also to meet the current standards. And there are several, rules vary from city to city in several ways you can work around that or prove that something's meeting the code intent, even though it may not be built specifically to the modern code. So, yeah.
You mentioned the Jackson School, and I was on the committee that was designing the Jackson School building where the Institute for Geophysics is next to the Bureau of Economic Geology building. The Bureau building was built in 1980, and the practical thing would have been just to extend that building. But had we done that, we would have had to completely change the BEG to modern code, and that would have cost, I don't know, $20 million. So what they did is they put the two buildings 15 feet apart, which was the legal separation, and then they built a connector. So the answer is, if you build a building now, you have to do modern standards, and you may want to avoid all the buildings where you'd have to take care of that. The Jackson School is a good example. If we can avoid engineering, we're going to do it.
We're right down the street. You can just call us up, and we'll help you out.
$20 million? No way.
That's the business school.
Oh.
It's coming.
I had a question about the slide before with the water sloshing. Yeah, so if you're putting the water at the top of the building, isn't that also going to affect the mass loading at the top of the structure?
Yeah, you're right. So it's a trade-off. With many engineering solutions that we have, there's always a trade-off. Here you are adding more mass times acceleration, right? That's a force that you do have to design for, but it's also helping to reduce that vibration. It also has another benefit that now you have a bunch of water on top of the building so that after the earthquake, say the power's out, you don't need a generator to pump out water if you have fires, so you can actually use that as your fire suppression water that's just gravity fed during an earthquake. So there's pros and cons. You know, we take all these considerations when we're designing.
Follow-up question, has anything like this been done before, or is this
Yeah, this photo up on top is actually from a building in San Francisco. It was designed, I want to say by MKA structural engineers. They do some pretty innovative stuff. But yeah, this has actually been used.
Can I ask just as far as using damping methods, I mean, for Type A 101 with the tune mass damper, is that something that they use to monitor as far as, I mean, not just like, oh, this will counter any vibration that the building has, but do they also, I mean, I guess with water, can they use this as a method to log, like, hey, these are some of the, I guess we monitor the movement of the water, and so now that's how we know what our building's going through, or is that just something they don't?
Probably. There are many ways you can monitor the movement of a building. You can put sensors. Basically, the accelerometers that are in your phone, we use more expensive versions of those. I don't know why we just don't slap iPhones onto things.
iPhone 12.
And attach those to buildings to also monitor shaking levels. So you might be able to do it in ways easier than monitoring water moving. But actually, tune mass dampers is the same concept here. In Type A 101, it's actually designed more for the wind loading, so it's meant to counteract the wind.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay. And is there a I guess a good, like, a golden ratio for how much something like that should weigh in relation to the building?
So there's physics involved in that. So you know the weight of a mass on a string?
Yeah.
and you let it go, and it's going to go at a natural period. So they try to, the tuned part of that tuned mass damper is they're trying to tune that mass and that length of that string so that it's shaking at the same frequency that the building naturally wants to shake at. So that's the tuned part. And in the water tanks, that's where those baffles come in. You're applying those baffles to change the rate, the speed at which that water can flow through to try to tune it to the building's frequency.
Back over here, Lindsay.
Is water pretty much considered the optimal damper in terms of these engineering uses? Also, like, due to their secondary uses, especially like if they're positioned on top of?
Yeah, no, actually a more common fluid that we'll use for damping is actually like a viscous oil. So we use viscous dampers, so they just look like the struts that you might have in your car or on like a swinging door, you know, those little things that dampen the door so it doesn't slam every time. Just bigger versions of that. We put them diagonally, like braces in a structure, to also kind of dissipate that energy as that oil flows back and forth in the damper. There's even cases of putting this viscous fluid in the walls of a building so that as it moves back and forth, that viscous fluid is just, it's absorbing that energy through friction, moving back and forth.
Roxanne, let's move on. And also, I noticed in the early stuff you never showed that infrastructure clip. Is there going to be time for that at the end?
Oh, maybe
I think there will be.
Play it as we leave.
Okay, we're having, you know, yeah, I think there will be. So we'll
Okay,
come
good.
back to that.
Because that was wonderful. It was about.
We'll play it.
It made fun of engineers. That was great.
Yeah, even I enjoyed it.
All right, so let's talk about tidal waves. Oops. Well, there we go.
Okay, next topic. Tsunami destroys downtown San Francisco or Los Angeles. Is this plausible or implausible? Next. Well, how does an earthquake cause a tsunami? Well, typically you have a fault that's stuck underwater. And so in this case, you have the fault that's stuck in the right hand on the upper. As stress builds up, the part of the earth goes higher and part of the earth goes lower because of stress. It's storing energy. Then in the lower right, the fault slips suddenly, which means suddenly the earth that's higher goes lower and the earth that's lower goes higher. And so water either gets raised up or put down, and so you get a wave traveling away. Okay, next slide. So to cause a tsunami, the seafloor has to displace water vertically by lifting it up or dropping it down. Next slide. So in the San Andreas Fault, the motion is horizontal. It's not up and down. It's mostly horizontal. So that would be unlikely to cause much of a tsunami. Second of all, the San Andreas Fault is mostly on land, so it doesn't lift any water. So that's unlikely to cause a tsunami. Now, the one thing I will say is that some tsunamis do make waves that are 50 or 100 feet wide. That is, if you look at the champions, the Krakatoa volcano in, 1882, and so on. So you can get 50 and 100-foot tsunamis, at least locally, but not in California. So the verdict is implausible. Next.
I say, well, if we had this tsunami, as an engineer, the civil engineer, would we be able to survive this? So if we look at, this is from NOAA distributes how fast the tsunami wave moves. So this is actually from that event, from that first movie clip that we saw. It was based on a true story.
Yeah,
right?
could I interrupt?
Yeah.
Those first movie clips look very plausible to me. That is, I saw pictures after the Indonesian tsunami in Thailand that were taken in a resort, and those things practically could have been, they were very realistic.
I think this was based on a true story of a family that was actually in Thailand in a resort.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, that's good. Because I think this particular location, they actually had a couple hours worth of warning or time after the earthquake actually struck. The issue is actually getting the word out to people that there's a tsunami that might occur. You might have as little as 10 to 20 minutes warning if the earthquake happens close to land, but further away you can have hours of warning. And I think the actual Thailand example, as I was reading up about it, is the government actually knew that there was the potential for a tsunami, but they decided not to make the alert because it was the peak tourist season, and they didn't want to make a false alarm and cause a lot of uproar. So there you go.
Earthquakes are good for business, our business. Tsunamis are bad for business.
But if you did have ample warning, we have warning systems, sirens that will go off, and you're immediately informed to try to find highland. Natural highland is good, but if you don't have ground that moves upwards, you can, we actually design and build vertical evacuation shelters, so places for people just to get up and away from the height of the wave that we might expect from a tsunami. This is a bit of an impractical use for a structure, so we can think more practically and use these in things like parking garages, or maybe have school gymnasiums or some other space beneath, so it's not just a useless structure that's only used for the off chance that you have a tsunami. But we can design buildings to get up and away from that incoming wave. In Japan, they actually say, well, how about you just build a little ark that is waterproof and you can just float away in the tsunami. So you can have one of these in your backyard too if you want. So we can actually survive a large tsunami with proper warning and proper engineering.
When I was a kid in the Midwest, for tornadoes, there were shelters you put underground. And how often did we use them? Well, never in my life, but you build for that. So if you were living in parts of the coast in Oregon, having a little float-away structure wouldn't be any different, really.
Yeah. And there are parts along the Oregon coast that are these little spits of land where if you actually did try to want to evacuate people, there's only one road on, one road off, so it would create a huge traffic jam. So that's where you want to just try to get people up vertically as quick as you can, because there's no way, even given the ample time, that people could drive out.
And now for our next scientific topic.
Are we going to show the clips?
There will be.
Okay. So, well, first of all, I was told that all the movies, disaster movies I knew were old movies, and that the audience wouldn't know about them. But I just wanted to say that the best movie of all time, and I mean all categories, I mean science fiction, drama, realistic, historical. The best movie of all time is a movie called Dante's Peak. And of course, to be a great movie, it has to have a great message. And the message of Dante's Peak is that seismologists are sexy and you should do what they say. Next slide. And of course, the hero of Dante's Peak was Pierce Brosnan. You might know him because he was James Bond in the James Bond movies. You know, Agent 007, earthquake seismologists, the jobs are really pretty much the same. Remember, seismologists are so sexy and you should do what they say. Okay, next.
Now, the Sendai quake in Japan was considered to be one of the 5 strongest since 1900. It was so powerful, in fact, that it moved the main island of Japan 8 feet.
This is just one of the 1.3 million earthquakes that occur around the globe each year. The largest ever recorded here in North America, Anchorage, Alaska, 1964, a 9.1. The earth shook for 5 straight minutes. The energy release was the equivalent of 10 million atom bombs the size of the one dropped on Hiroshima. And that's not the biggest earthquake ever recorded. No, the biggest was 4 years earlier off the coast of Valdivia in southern Chile, a 9.5 on the Richter scale, right there. Bam. This quake lasted 11 minutes and spawned a tsunami 82 feet high that leveled Hilo, Hawaii, 8,000 miles away. 8,000 miles away. So, it's mass destruction like this that shows just how important the research that we're doing here is, because we need to be able to predict these things, right? To plan and prepare for them. Yes, ma'am?
Professor, do you think something that intense could happen here?
Well, the San Andreas Fault runs right up the spine of California. It's the demarcation line between 2 tectonic plates that are constantly moving. And add to that the fact that it's supposed to happen every 150 years, and we're about 100 years overdue. I'd say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Okay, now, let's look at credibility of casting here. Or are we going to have the... Oh, okay,
Yeah,
next clip. Next clip.
Or maybe not. Nope, we're just moving on. We're just moving on. It wouldn't play.
It wouldn't play. Okay. Well, credibility of classic. Paul Giamatti, is he credible as a seismologist? Next. Well, it turns out when I saw this movie, I thought it was a friend of mine named Bill Ellsworth, who's a senior seismologist at the U.S. Geological Survey. And, you know, I've published a couple of papers with this guy. He just retired last year and got a job as a professor at Stanford. I mean, you know, glasses, beard, high forehead. Next slide. I mean, who do you know who's a seismologist who has glasses, beard, you know, high forehead? Next slide. So yeah, credibility of classing, beard, glasses, potbelly, very sexy. This is very plausible. I mean, these guys look like seismologists. And we can't get the tremors clip?
I was not able to get it to play. We can maybe, I can go and pull it out of the PowerPoint and play it later, but.
Okay, should we do the slides with it anyway?
Yeah, we'll just go ahead and do this.
Okay, now, there's always the question of female seismologists and credibility of casting, and we had a clip from an old movie called Tremors, where there are these things called graboids, which are worms that go underground and cause earthquakes. And some of you, how many have seen it? Well, anyway, it has a female seismologist, and my wife is an English professor here at the university, and actually one secret I've learned is that all English professors I know, all they do in their spare time is watch movies, and they don't care whether they're good movies or bad movies, they just love drama. Anyway, her sense of, she can barely tolerate disaster movies with female scientists because they portray the scientists, they're always young, they're always stunningly beautiful in sort of a perky kind of way, and they're always wearing tank tops or scanty clothing to show off their personal assets. And in terms of the Tremors movie, the seismologist is an actress named Finn Carter. And, you know, the question is she credible as a seismologist? And so, well, she's sexy. You know, she could work in my lab. Sure, why not? However, in terms of fashion, another secret of science is it turns out that science is really all about fashion. In terms of fashion, it's not credible. And here she is, she's working in the desert. She doesn't have a hat. She doesn't have a long sleeves to take care of sunburn. She doesn't have long pants. I mean, there seems to be brambles there. There's cactus. She has no boots in case she gets bitten by a snake. I mean, that skin isn't going to last very long if she dresses like that. So in terms of fashion, she does not look like any scientist that I know who works in the desert, male or female.
Looks like she's got that stuff on her nose, maybe.
Well, that's, and it's so cute, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, next slide. However, after the graboids arrive, and this is a graboid, it turns out graboids, they're like mosquitoes. Not only do they make earthquakes, they like cows and people. After actually her red wardrobe incredibility improves, and she starts wearing a long sleeve shirt and slacks. So anyway, that's half plausible.
Any casting or fashion questions for our experts here?
Experts.
Okay, if not, I'm gonna move out of this quickly and try to get something that we really wanted you guys to see. That was a lot of fun. Let's see if I can get to it here. Would be in here, I hope. Let's see. Or maybe not. All right. Well, while I'm looking for some clips that we particularly wanted to show you that unfortunately wouldn't play, I do want to thank our presenters, Drs. Clayton and Froelich, for a really fun show and a really educational show. I want to thank you all for coming. Question askers who got T-shirts, if you feel like maybe you want a different size of T-shirt, please see our fashion expert here who will help you to make a switch. When you came in, you should have received a little half sheet of paper. That's our feedback form. We really, really value your feedback. We want to know what you thought about tonight's program. We also want to know about programs for the future. So if you want to make suggestions, it could be about a topic you'd like to see someone address. It could be about a movie or movies or TV shows that you want to see someone debunk. Or maybe you know someone who you think would be a really fun and energetic presenter and you'd like to suggest that we reach out to that person and ask them to be a science study break alum like these folks now are. So please do the half sheet, and then you can, there's a young woman standing by the door at the back. She'll be happy to take that from you. And thank you very much. And now I'll see if I can work my way out of my little technical problem here.
Now, while she's doing that, obviously people can leave if they have to, but Tricia and I, between us, have spent more than a half century of our lives studying earthquakes. And so if there's ever a question you wanted to ask an earthquake seismology expert, now is your chance. And we'll answer questions until we get thrown out of the room, and we'd even answer them in the hall, I expect. But, you know.
So together, over 50 years? Is that what?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah.
I didn't think you had.
I think that's a good number.
I've been studying earthquakes since 1972, which would be 44 years.
Yep, about 50 years.
Would I lie?
No.
Maybe.
You can do the math real quick.
Yes, question.
Yeah, I've got a question about liquefaction of the soil. How often does that happen with earthquakes?
Liquefaction. Yeah. So it's actually a phenomenon that happens when you have loose, sandy soils that are saturated. So you have to have a perfect combination of some sand layer somewhere in the soil and it be saturated, so near some body of water after heavy rains. And what's happening when the earthquake shakes, those loose, sandy particles want to settle. As they settle, the water rises and it creates a layer of water essentially that can't resist any load. So the ground sinks, the water comes up. It does happen, and it's in Christchurch, New Zealand, for example, with the earthquakes there in the 2010-2011 region, large areas of the city were devastated by liquefaction. So homes sinking, that people aren't allowed to rebuild there, so people are completely displaced in large parts of the city. High-rises in Japan have sunk due to this. In Chile, same thing. Even in the Pawnee earthquake in Oklahoma not that long ago, a couple weeks ago, last month, I guess, we saw evidence of some very small, much smaller scale, no building sinking or anything, but smaller scale liquefaction. So you get any wet, sandy layer and shaking of it, you can get liquefaction.
Now, your second question said, does this happen often? The answer is it happens a lot more often than you'd think. First of all, many of the world's great cities are on coastlines, and so because land is so valuable, they build land by taking sandy dirt and putting it out there. So for example, in the 1906, the Marina District was famous for its earthquake damage. That was built land that was built for the World's Fair of whatever, the year 10 years before. And just 2 blocks away, outside that district, there wasn't nearly as much damage. A city like Tokyo, some of the most expensive real estate in the world, you'll be not surprised to learn that a lot of it is on reclaimed land. Also, by a rare coincidence, Mexico City is an old lake bed. There's no lake bed there now, but it just happens to be on the same kind of stuff. Also, the Nicaragua earthquake of 1972 is on an old lake. So you say, does this happen often? It happens a lot.
All right, let's see if, oh, go ahead with the question. We had a question. Someone? No?
I have an answer if there's no question.
Okay.
One thing that happens in my life about once a year is some Jehovah's Witnesses come up to my door. And these are invariably men in dark suits, and they come up to me and they say, sir, you know, the end of the world is going to be pretty soon. Are you ready? And I say, you know, gee, how do we know that? And they say, well, for example, earthquakes are happening more and more frequently than they used to. And of course, I perk up, you know, really? Well, okay, it turns out that people can actually study this, you know, seismologists, these guys. It turns out as far as there's no evidence that earthquakes are more frequent globally than they ever were. However, one thing is true is they cause a lot more damage. The reason is as population goes up, more and more people, more and more building, and you get damage. For example, Paul Giamatti, the seismologist in San Andreas, was talking about earthquakes in California. In 1857, there was a magnitude 8-ish earthquake in Southern California in what we call Los Angeles. When that earthquake happened in 1857, I believe 1 cow was killed. Well, the same, a magnitude 8 in Los Angeles now, and I don't know whether it would be tens of billions or hundreds of billions, but hundreds and thousands of people would die, and it would be a real mess. And so even a number of years ago, 20 years ago, there was a magnitude 7-something in Taiwan. It brought down a bunch of electronics industries. It had global implications because people making televisions or the electronics controllers for cars and things couldn't get them for a few months. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are wrong that earthquakes are more frequent. They are absolutely right that they're going to cause more damage and more serious damage than they used to. Thank you for that question.
You cannot tell me that you are not interested in this, because every summer people flock to see our infrastructure threatened by terrorists or aliens. But we should care just as much when it's under threat from the inevitable passage of time. The problem is, no one has made a blockbuster movie about the importance of routine maintenance and repair. Or they haven't. Until now.
Where a few feet of concrete can mean the difference between life and death. Where everything you love can be taken from you in the blink of an eye. A few brave souls are willing to risk everything to make nothing happen. Hello?
It's time. For your biennial bridge inspection. I've got Thursday afternoon or Friday anytime before 3.
This summer, get ready for infrastructure. Brace yourself for 98 heart-pounding minutes of incremental maintenance.
I'm not showing any cracking. No dilapidation. No spalls on the concrete deck. But you got mild corrosion on the beams. You're going to have to keep an eye on that. Thank you, sir. Don't get cocky.
The New York Times calls infrastructure necessary, and something I never thought about, but yeah, sure.
This has got boundaries. Behind you. Sandwich. This thing is going to blow. 15, 20 years. Which is why it's so important that we caught it early.
In this line of work, one mistake could be catastrophic.
It's loose, boss. The bolt is loose.
Well, then tighten it, goddammit.
I don't know which way.
Okay, listen to me. Listen. Let me loose it. Right and tight. Talk to me, what's going on?
Rolling Stone says nothing happens, and that's probably for the best.
I came here to chew bubble gum and inspect bridges.
You want to see terrible puns about engineering you don't fully understand?
Looks like somebody needs to get their ducks in a row.
You want to see 20-minute monologues on the structural integrity of girders?
I'm ordering uniaxial tests of the slab transverse to the deck corrugations with additional reinforcement and tension tests of the support fastener connections between the deck and the girders. Bitch.
Really routine maintenance that you can handle?
They used PVC piping when they should have used CPVC piping. God help us.
You want to see infrastructure. Featuring an all-star cast, plus two-time Academy Award nominee Edward Norton. Sorry, three-time Academy Award nominee Edward Norton. And introducing, as the Chief, Steve Buscemi.
I'm the best damn inspector in the business. And I'm here to inspect us down.
Coming summer 2015, infrastructure is anything except we've done it wrong.
Sausage sandwich?
Of course.
Oh, here's the Tremors clip.
I don't see any eyes. Must be totally subterranean. And those tentacles.
Yeah. You know, I think they shoot right out of your mouth. And they hook you. They pull you right in. They wish stop before it killed anybody else.
Look, this is important now. This is like, let's just say it. This is probably the biggest zoological discovery of the century.
Hey! Hey, check this out! I found the ass end! Jesus, we really caught something here!
Wow.
Man, that's one big mother.
This must be the old boy had your seismos working overtime.
Yeah. Yeah, it must push itself along with these. All of them pushing at once. That's why it moves so fast. I mean, this thing had sensors tripping all over the place. No.
Hey, Rhonda, you ever heard of anything like this before? Oh, sure. Well, everybody knows about it. We just didn't tell you. Oh, hell, man, don't ever saw anything like this. We're really on to something here.
I'll tell you one damn thing. Old Chang come get his slick mitts on this for a measly $15.
You got that right. All right, here's the plan. We need a flat dip. Yeah, right, with a winch. Yes, fine. No. Don't want a winch to tear it all up. All right, cream. Yeah, cream with those lifting straps.
Hey, shut up! The way I figure it, there's 3 more of these things.
What?
3 more?
I've got seismographs all over this valley. Now you compare the different readings. Here's one at 2 o'clock yesterday. But here's one 3 miles away at the exact same time, and that's 2. But here...
Yeah, we'll take your word for it.
Yeah, well, where's the trunk?
Just beyond that hill.
Damn prairie dog burrow. Oh, son of a bitch. This way.
Up on that rock!
Okay, so.
Thank you.
Okay, Deathless Cinema. Thanks so much for being here, and do leave us the half-sheet feedback form. We really appreciate it. Have a good night, and I guess the only thing left to say is go Cubs. Yeah. So.